Basically, we're asking this question here. How did Islam begin? Who was Muhammad? And where did the Quran come from? Now, I'm interested in asking what history tells us about these three areas. What does history say concerning how Islam began? According to Islam, and if you ask any Muslim, they'll say this, that Muhammad is the last and greatest prophet, that the Quran is his revelation, that it is the eternal revelation that has always existed, was revealed to him over a 22-year period from 610 to 632. That is the final revelation, and it corrects everything that's gone before. So we don't need anything after the Qur'an, and that Islam, therefore, is the final religion based on Muhammad's, not only his life, but also his sayings. That's the sunnah of the Prophet. That would be the sirah and the hadith. Now, conclusion is, of course, that Islam is completely dependent on the book and the man, the Quran and Muhammad. Absolutely dependent on those two. Without the book, without the man, Islam falls. And I would suggest that we are also dependent on a book and a man as well, are we not? We also have the Bible and we have Jesus Christ. So in some ways, everything I'm going to say today should also be asked of Christianity. And I would suggest of any religion, you should ask the same thing. If there is a scriptured religion, as Islam and Christianity are, we must also ask these historical questions. Now, what we want to do, therefore, is look at the book of the man. And we want to say and ask whether or not history gives us a different story. Now, what do Muslims believe? Well, they believe that Muhammad was born in 570, that in 610 he went into a cave called the Hira cave, and there he met an angel called Jibril, or Gabriel as we would know him, who said Akra, which means recite. He says Ma'akra, I cannot recite. He could not read or write. And so the angel squeezed him 3 times. Finally, after the 3rd time, let him go. He went back to Mecca, went and told his wife Khadija, the only wife of that time, what had just happened. She did a test, gave 3 different tests, passed all 3, then told him to go see her cousin Waraka ibn Nawfal. And having seen the cousin Waraka ibn Nawfal, recited and related what had just happened in the cave. It is Waraka ibn Nawfal that tells Muhammad he is a prophet. Waraka ibn Nawfal was a Nestorian Christian. That's one of the ironies of history. You have a Nestorian Christian giving the authority for Muhammad as a prophet right there in 610. Now, from 610 to 622, he then received these revelations. When you look at the Quran, the last half of the Quran, from Surah 20 up to 114, that's the Meccan surahs, according to Islamic tradition. Remember, everything I'm telling you is what the traditions tell us. This is the classical account. Then in 621, he wakes up in the middle of the night, and he's told to get on the back of the winged horse called the Burak, goes up to Jerusalem, ascends the 7 heavens, meets God, or Allah, who tells him to pray 50 times a day, comes down 2 heavens to the 5th heaven. Moses asks him, how many times are you to pray? 50 times, he's told. And so he says, go back and see if you can get it back down. So he bounces back between Allah and Moses, between the 7th and 5th heaven, gets it down to 45, 40, 35, 30, 15, 10, finally down to 5 prayers. Moses says, that's enough. So then he heads on down to earth, goes back to Mecca. That's the Miraj. That's the story of the Miraj. Happens in 621. In 622, then, he moves from Mecca up to Medina with about 80 followers. And that starts the political agenda. That's where he starts to take control. That's where he starts to get authority. And then you have the Medinan surahs, the first half of the Quran, which is only 20 chapters, much longer chapters. And that's where the problem begins for most Muslims even today. So from 622 to 632, the last 10 years of his life, you have these Medinan revelations. In 630, he goes and marches down into Mecca, takes it over without firing a shock. In 632, he suddenly dies, as most people tend to do. Now, we don't know how he died. Some traditions say he was poisoned. Whatever the case is, he dies in 632 without ever having written the Quran down. It still was not compiled. It was received, but not written down, okay? Then in 632 to 634, you have Abu Bakr, who's the first caliph. He is the first to write the Quran down. And that's given to one of Muhammad's wives named Hafsa. She keeps it under her bed for about 18 years. Umar comes to power from 634 to 644. In the next 10 years, he is killed. Uthman takes over power, and it's Uthman from 644 to 656, the next 12 years. In that period, he has the Quran rewritten again because there are many different versions appearing, according to the traditions. And then the Qur'an is finalized. So the Qur'an that we have today is that Qur'an. And when you talk to Muslims, they'll call it the Uthmanic recension. This is the Uthmanic Qur'an they talk about. About 650 is the date that they give to it. He is killed, and then in 656 to 661, Ali, who the Shiites believe is the rightful heir to Muhammad. He is the adopted son of Muhammad. He takes over power for only 5 years, and then is killed by Muawiyah there at the Battle of Siffin. Now, that's the classic account. Have any of you heard any other account? That's just the bare bones. I'm just giving you a quick skeleton. That's the classical account that everybody is taught all over the world. You go to any university, any college, any school in the world, and you'll hear this account. That's how Islam began, with this man in that place doing those things at that time. Do any of you doubt it? Is there any reason to doubt it? Now, you two guys who put your hands up, you're smiling because I know where you're going to go with this. But does anybody else doubt it? Why could you and why should you doubt it? There's no reason to doubt it, because that's all we've been told. We're going to show you that there's some problems with this. First of all, everything I've just told you comes from whom? Who is the person that tells us who Muhammad is, what he did, where he lived, how the Quran was revealed? Well, you need to go to his biography. Now, who should have written his biography? Somebody living at his time, somebody who knew him, right? You would hope that someone who knew would write down what he did and what he said. The first man to write down anything about him is Ibn Ishaq. Look at the day he dies. 765. Muhammad died in 632. How many years? But we don't have anything of Ibn Ishaq. Nothing exists from Ibn Ishaq's. We don't know anything that he said except because of this man, Ibn Hisham. Ibn Hisham takes what Ibn Ishaq writes, is given to it by another one, a disciple of Ibn Ishaq, and he throws anything that he doesn't like and only retains what he likes, and finally writes it down in 833. Muhammad dies in 632. How many years? 200. So the first biography we have of Muhammad is 200 years after the fact. Nothing earlier than Ibn Hisham. Does that bother any of you? What about what Muhammad said? Because that's much greater. The hadith are much more prolific. The first person to write down the hadith would be this man here, Al-Bukhari. Sahih Bukhari is what is known as. Sahih Bukhari, he dies in 870. He wrote between 850 and 870, that 20-year period. So everything we know about what Muhammad said comes from this man and others who come after. Sahih Muslim, Ibn Dawud, Tirmidhi, and the others. But they all come after Al-Bukhari. That's 240 years after the fact. Which means everything we know about who Muhammad is, what he said, and as far as the tafsir is concerned, and the tahriq, which would be the commentaries that explain the Quran, and the tahriq, which would be the histories of mankind, all first written by this man, Al-Tabari, and he dies in 923. That's the 10th century. So everything we know about what happened over here in the 7th century does not come from the 8th century. It comes from the 9th century, 200 to 300 years after the fact. And that's why today, historians are asking, hold on a minute, let's look at Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is also a historical figure. He also lived in history. He also lived in a certain place, did certain things, said different things. We know about his biography, do we not? Is there not a siddha of Jesus written down? Yes, there is. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Is there not also the hadith of Jesus, which would be the sayings of Jesus? Yes, there is. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In my Bible, whenever Jesus speaks, it's red letters. That's the hadith of Jesus. So there's the parallels. Those are the parallels. The New Testament basically is nothing more than the sunnah of Jesus. Like you have the sunnah of Muhammad, you have the sunnah of Jesus. But take a look and see when they were written down. We know that Paul's letters are written within 20 to 30 years. We know that 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are written within 40 years of Christ's death. We know that John comes much later, around 92 AD. So 60 years is the latest we get. Now, hold on a minute. Even if you look at those 4, 2 of them actually knew Jesus, did they not? Matthew and John were actually disciples of Jesus. They lived with him. They saw what he did. They heard what he said. They wrote down what they knew. And the other 2, Mark and Luke, got it from the eyewitnesses. So at the most, what you would say, the earliest that we have for the hadith and the siddha and the tafsir, because the tafsir would be the commentaries, that's Paul's letters. Commentaries means explains what Jesus did. That's what Paul does in Ephesus, in Philippi, in Corinth, in Colossus. He then writes and expounds on what Jesus said and did. There's the commentaries. The tahriq would be the book of Acts, the history of the early church. So we've got the exact same four genre in the New Testament that they have in Islam. But whereas our tafsir and our sunnah of Jesus comes within 15 to 60 years of Christ's death, written by the eyewitnesses and those who knew the eyewitnesses, the sunnah of Muhammad comes to 200 to 300 years later. If we were dependent on the gospel of Jesus Christ from what Islam is dependent on, we would know nothing about what Jesus did or said for until the 3rd century. How would we defend him? Yet, is this the first time you're hearing this? Is this taught in any school? Why aren't they teaching this in Bible schools and seminaries? Why aren't we being told just how hopeless an authority Islam is dependent on? That's just the first problem. We're going to get into lots of problems today. Now, that's why the scholars are now asking some very deep questions. They're asking and saying, Islam as we know it did not exist in the 7th century, but evolved over a period of 200 to 300 years. The Qur'an probably was not revealed to one man in 22 years, but looks like it evolved over a period of 50 to 100 years. That's a pretty big statement. Therefore, their conclusion is the history of Islam, at least from the time of Caliph Abdul Malik, he is the one, the Caliph from the Marwanid Caliphate under the Umayyad Caliphate from 685 to 705. It is he that we're now looking at, and almost all the scholars are looking at him because that's where we see Islam beginning. But Muhammad died in 632. He comes to power in 685. Do your maths. You can see the problem. We'll unpack that a bit. So the scholars' conclusion, and this is what they're asking, if so much of the history of early Islam was written down so late, why did they take so long to write it down? Ask your Muslim friends this. I ask them all the time, and they say, well, they were illiterate. Hold on a minute. Illiterate. Do you really believe that they were illiterate? Remember, by 642, they had taken over Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo. Within 10 years of the Prophet Muhammad's death, within 10 years, the 5 great cities of the Levant were under their jurisdiction. And outside of Jerusalem, they're still under their jurisdiction, 1400 years later. By the end of the 7th century, by the time Abdul Malik comes to power, we're still in the 7th century. They controlled all the land from Spain all the way to India. Are you telling me that nobody between Spain and India could read or write?